Okay, continuing on here with Oswald Spengler in the introduction to Decline of the West. We're on page 13 of the unabridged volume here, subsection 5, where he's talking about the differences between historic cultures and ahistoric cultures. And remember that he had said that there are two, and only two, ahistoric cultures, India and the classical world. They're both ahistoric, and and so he brings up the disposal of the dead because he wants to say it's not an accident that these are the only two cultures who burn their dead. Burning the dead is part of an ahistoric mentality of wanting to cut the mind free from the past and not have any encumbrances. Both India and the West have this in common. And so he says, in opposition to this mighty group of Egyptian life symbols, we meet at the threshold of the classical culture the custom, typifying the ease with which it could forget every piece of its inward and outward past, of burning the dead. Now remember that Erwin Roda, who had written the book Psyche in the 19th century, had said that the Dorians bringing in burning of the dead and pushing out the Mycenaean cult of hero worship and preserving the dead indicates a severing of ties with the underworld, and the underworld going dark, and a turning away from the past toward the future. India, by the way, didn't do this. India brought in burning of the dead, and it's an ahistoric culture, but it remained bound to the past. It did remain bound to the cult of the ancestors, all the great rishis and yogis and sannyasins, all the great teachers. There's always a deference in India to the authority of a master, the authority of a guru. We've got it the other way around. We only give respect to a master up to the point that we decide to leave him behind and surpass him. The West has a tradition of wanting to surpass one's teacher, just as Plotinus surpassed Ammonius Saccas by writing the Enneads. So we have a completely different tradition, completely different attitude toward authority in the West versus the East, even though they're both cultures burn the dead. So there's that. To the Mycenaean age, the elevation into a ritual of this particular funerary method, amongst all those practiced in turn by Stone Age peoples, was essentially alien, as we have seen. The Mycenaeans did not burn their dead. They had a hero cult. They had the tholoi. Indeed, its royal tombs suggest that earth burial was regarded as peculiarly honorable, and I think that the reason for that, why the Mycenaeans retained this tradition of having womb-shaped tholoi and putting the dead hero on the inside, is that it's a survival from them being Indo-Aryans, and the Indo-Aryans go back 5,000 BC. They originate somewhere in the Caucasus range, between the Caucasus and the Black Sea, somewhere in that area. And their style of burial was always to make kurgan mounds. They would make a womb-shaped mound and put one dead hero inside of it, possibly along with his wife and children as well. The ritual of sati was part of the Indo-Aryan world, and they brought that into India with them. So I think this is a leftover. The Mycenaeans burying their dead inside tholoi, that's a leftover from their kurgan practices. But in Homeric Greece, as in Vedic India, we find a change, so sudden that its origins must necessarily be psychological, from burial to that burning which, the Iliad gives the full pathos of the symbolic act, was the ceremonial completion of death and the denial of all historical duration. From this moment, the plasticity of the individual, spiritual evolution, was at an end. Classical drama admitted truly historical motifs just as little as it allowed themes of inward evolution, and it is well known how decisively the Hellenic instinct set itself against portraiture in the arts. Right into the Imperial Period, classical art handled only the matter that was, so to say, natural to it, the myth. And there's a footnote here where he says, from Homer to the tragedies of Seneca, a full 1,000 years, the same handful of myth figures, Thyestes, Clytemnestra, Heracles, and the like, appear time after time without alteration. That's an interesting fact, too. He's right about this. From Aeschylus to Seneca, from start to finish, they're still writing about the same myth figures. Oedipus. Seneca has an Oedipus play, I think, and a Medea play. It's all the same characters; they never change. That's an interesting fact about the evolution of classical literature. It's the same characters from start to finish. Whereas he says here, whereas in the poetry of the West, Faustian man figures first as Parzival or Tristan, then modified always into harmony with epoch as Hamlet, Don Quixote, Don Juan, and eventually Faust or Werther, and now is the hero of the modern world city romance, but is always presented in the atmosphere and under the conditions of a particular century. All our characters in the Faustian West change. They're different. From Parsifal to Michael Corleone and Luke Skywalker, the characters are different. They transform. We've got a historical consciousness par excellence, and we're always interested in new characters that embody the spirit of their age, the way Goethe's Faust does. It embodies the entire spirit, not only of Goethe's age and the Enlightenment, but the entire civilization. And at some point, I think, as an offshoot of this series, I want to read Faust, Goethe's Faust, and go through that chapter by chapter, do that as a kind of spin-off. Remember how in TV series in the 70s they would do spin-offs? Like they would have All in the Family, so you would watch All in the Family, and then they'd be like, oh, these characters are cool, let's do the Jeffersons. So they'd get a spin-off, or Maude, and then they'd do a spin-off there again. They did a bunch of spin-offs from All in the Family, all very successful. So I'm thinking about this project as we go along, having spin-offs. And one of the spin-offs I want to do is going through Faust, chapter by chapter, as well as Thomas Mann's great opus, Joseph and His Brothers, and Nikos Kazantzakis' great epic, The Odyssey, a Modern Sequel. I want to do spin-off episodes on all three of those. That'll be fun. So, right into the Imperial Period, classical art handled only the matter that was, so to say, natural to it, the myth, only mythical. Even the ideal portraits of Hellenistic sculpture are mythical, of the same kind as the typical biographies of Plutarch's sort. No great Greek ever wrote down any recollections that would serve to fix a phase of experience for his inner eye. Not even Socrates has told, regarding his inward life, anything important in our sense of the word. It is questionable indeed whether for a classical mind it was even possible to react to the motive forces that are presupposed in the production of a Parzival, a Hamlet, or a Werther. In Plato, we fail to observe any conscious evolution of doctrine. I would disagree with that. I've read most of Plato, and his ideas do change over, starting with the Apology and Socrates' complete denial of the afterlife. He says, to fear death is to presume to know what death is, in the Apology. But then later, Plato changes this attitude. Socrates, I presume, is always his mouthpiece, and gives a very elaborate cosmology of the afterlife and the other side. So I think his ideas do change. That'd be great to do a Plato series, too, a chapter by chapter on Plato. His separate works are merely treatises written from very different standpoints, which he took up from time to time, and it gave him no concern whether and how they hung together. On the contrary, a work of deep self-examination, the Vita Nuova of Dante, is found at the very outset of the spiritual history of the West. How little, therefore, of the classical pure present there really was in Goethe, the man who forgot nothing, the man whose works, as he avowed himself, are only fragments of a single great confession. That's what Goethe called his works. They're all one single great confession, so his scholarship is disguised autobiography, as it is in the West. That's not the case with the classical civilization. Their scholarship is not disguised autobiography. Ours is in the West. After the destruction of Athens by the Persians, all the older artworks were thrown on the dust heap, whence we are now extracting them. And we do not hear that anyone in Hellas ever troubled himself about the ruins of Mycenae or Phaistos for the purpose of ascertaining historical facts. Men read Homer, but never thought of excavating the hill of Troy as Schliemann did. For what they wanted was myth, not history. The works of Aeschylus and those of the pre-Socratic philosophers were already partially lost in the Hellenistic period. In the West, on the contrary, the piety inherent in and peculiar to the culture manifested itself 5 centuries before Schliemann in Petrarch. The fine collector of antiquities, coins, and manuscripts, the very type of historically sensitive man, viewing the distant past and scanning the distant prospect. Was he not the first to attempt an alpine peak? He is. And I remember James Hillman in Revisioning Psychology, and also Gene Gebser in The Ever-Present Origin, they both start with Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux. He's the first to ascend a mountain in the West and experience infinite space and climb a mountain for the sake of climbing it. No one else ever did this except Westerners, climbing the mountain to conquer it in order to experience space. Think of that Caspar David Friedrich painting, which he has the man standing on the mountain with clouds down below him. That is the essence of the West, getting up to the peak and viewing the horizon with the infinite expanse of infinite space all around you. That is eminently Western. Petrarch's the first to do that, 1300-ish. Living in his time, yet essentially not of it, the soul of the collector is intelligible only by having regard to his conception of time. Even more passionate, perhaps, though of a different coloring, is the collecting bent of the Chinese. In China, whoever travels assiduously pursues old traces, Kuzi, and the untranslatable Tao, the basic principle of Chinese existence, derives all its meaning from a deep historical feeling. In the Hellenistic period, objects were indeed collected and displayed everywhere, but they were curiosities of mythological appeal, as described by Pausanias, as to which questions of date or purpose simply did not arise. And this too in the very presence of Egypt, which, even by the time of the great Tutmosis, had been transformed into one vast museum of strict tradition. Amongst the Western peoples, it was the Germans who discovered the mechanical clock, the dread symbol of the flow of time, and the chimes of countless clock towers that echo day and night over West Europe are perhaps the most wonderful expression of which a historical world feeling is capable. Right, and there's a footnote where he says, it was about 1000 AD, and therefore contemporaneously with the beginning of the Romanesque style and the Crusades, which corresponds to the Trojan War, and the Doric style, the first symptoms of a new soul that Abbot Gerbert, Pope Sylvester II, the friend of the Emperor Otto III, invented the mechanism of the chiming wheel clock. In Germany, too, the first tower clocks made their appearance about 1200, and the pocket watch somewhat later. Observe the significant association of time measurement with the edifices of religion. Very interesting point. Lewis Mumford wrote one of the first great books ever written about technology, along with Spengler's Man and Technics, is Lewis Mumford's Technics and Civilization, which is huge. Came out about the same time, and he too starts with this idea that the West begins with the mechanical clock that was invented by monks. It didn't have a clock face at first. It only chimed the hour so that the monks could be on time for their prayers. And Mumford says in that book that the emphasis on that is that it later lays out the grid work for the 9-to-5 employment world, and the clock timing the capitalist world of labor and labor management, and the clock laying the foundations for that. For him, the clock is the nucleus of Western technology, and it was invented by monks. Both Spengler and Mumford recognized this almost simultaneously. I think Technics and Civilization was 1936, the year Spengler died, and Man and Technics, I think, is 33, if I remember right. So yes, very important point here about the invention of the mechanical clock. In the timeless countrysides and cities of the classical world, we find nothing of the sort. Till the epoch of Pericles, the time of day was estimated merely by the length of shadow. And it was only from that of Aristotle that the word, my Greek is not good enough to read that word, received the Babylonian significance of hour. Prior to that, there was no exact subdivision of the day. In Babylon and Egypt, water clocks and sundials were discovered in the very early stages, yet in Athens it was left to Plato to introduce a practically useful form of clepsydra, and this was merely a minor adjunct of everyday utility which could not have influenced the classical life feeling in the smallest degree. It remains still to mention the corresponding difference, which is very deep and has never yet been properly appreciated, between classical and modern mathematics. So this is the first time he brings up mathematics as being also symbolic of the world soul of a particular Urzambala, of a particular civilization. It's not an accident that each one comes up with a specific type of mathematics. The history of mathematics, you don't get that in school. It's not taught chronologically. It's just thrown at kids as a jumble, as a heap, starting with arithmetic, then moving to multiplication, and then moving into geometry and algebra. It would make much better sense if it was taught chronologically, starting with Euclid, where there is no algebra and there are no equations, and Euclid's pretty simple to figure out. I've worked through the first book of Euclid's Elements, and I'm no good at mathematics, but I was able to do it with ease, just following the proofs, because it's not infected yet with algebra. Then you move from Euclid to algebra, which is a separate development, a subsequent development, and then go from there to Faustian mathematics, the differential calculus. If it was taught chronologically, it might be a lot easier for kids to learn, especially guys like me who think chronologically. The former conceived of things as they are, the classical. The former conceived of things as they are as magnitudes, timeless and purely present. And so it proceeded to Euclidean geometry and mathematical statics, rounding off its intellectual system with the theory of conic sections. We conceive things as they become and behave, as function. And this brought us to dynamics, analytical geometry, and thence to the differential calculus. This footnote says, Newton's choice of the name fluxions for his calculus was meant to imply a standpoint towards certain metaphysical notions as to the nature of time. In Greek mathematics, time figures not at all. The modern theory of functions is the imposing marshalling of this whole mass of thought. It is a bizarre but nevertheless psychologically exact fact that the physics of the Greeks, being statics and not dynamics, neither knew the use nor felt the absence of the time element, whereas we, on the other hand, work in thousandths of a second. The one and only evolution idea that is timeless, ahistoric, is Aristotle's entelechy, which of course is the forerunner of morphology, of the morphological form that develops through time. This then is our task. We men of the Western culture are, with our historical sense, an exception and not a rule. World history is our world picture and not all mankind's. Indian and classical man form no image of a world in progress, and perhaps when in due course the civilization of the West is extinguished, there will never again be a culture and a human type in which world history is so potent a form of the waking consciousness. Really interesting there, the obsession with time in the West. And even if you read Dante, as you go through Dante's trilogy, he always tells you the time of day, what the day is, what the month is, where everything is at. Our time consciousness in the West is quite exquisite, quite well expressed. Everything, we're concerned with the development and flow of everything. Time is part of the Faustian desire for infinity. So then he moves into this discussion, which I suppose we have enough time for, on what then is world history. So what is it? It's certainly an ordered presentation of the past, an inner postulate, the expression of a capacity for feeling form. But a feeling for form, however definite, is not the same as form itself. No doubt we feel world history, experience it, and believe that it is to be read just as a map is read. But even today, it is only forms of it that we know, and not the form of it, which is the mirror image of our own inner life. Everyone, of course, if asked, would say that he saw the inward form of history quite clearly and definitely. The illusion subsists because no one has seriously reflected on it, still less conceived doubts as to his own knowledge, for no one has the slightest notion how wide a field for doubt there is. In fact, the layout of world history is an unproved and subjective notion that has been handed down from generation to generation, not only of laymen, but of professional historians, and stands badly in need of a little of that skepticism which from Galileo onward has regulated and deepened our inborn ideas of nature. And I think Immanuel Velikovsky was somebody, I'm quite fond of Velikovsky, even though he's a nut, he's totally crazy, who comes in and pours skepticism on the Western timeline, the West's conception of the way things went, and he rearranges everything, and he goes through and he says there's no reason for why we have to stick with the timeline that we've been handed down to us in classrooms. He thinks there's a lot of gaps and mistakes. He kind of makes a mess out of things, but his fourfold trilogy, Ages and Chaos, is quite fun to read. Thanks to the subdivision of history into ancient, medieval, and modern, an incredibly jejune and meaningless scheme, which has, however, entirely dominated our historical thinking, we have failed to perceive the true position in the general history of higher mankind of the little part world which is developed on West European soil from the time of the German-Roman Empire, to judge of its relative importance, and above all to estimate its direction. The cultures that are to come will find it difficult to believe that the validity of such a scheme, with its simple rectilinear progression and its meaningless proportions, becoming more and more preposterous with each century, incapable of bringing into itself the new fields of history as they successively come into the light of our knowledge, was, in spite of all, never wholeheartedly attacked. The criticisms that it has long been the fashion of historical researchers to level at the scheme mean nothing. They have only obliterated the one existing plan without substituting for it any other. To toy with phrases such as the Greek Middle Ages or Germanic Antiquity does not in the least help us to form a clear and inwardly convincing picture in which China and Mexico, the empire of Axum, and that of the Sassanids have their proper places. And the expedient of shifting the initial point of modern history from the Crusades to the Renaissance, or from the Renaissance to the beginning of the 19th century, only goes to show that the scheme per se is regarded as unshakably sound. It is not only that the scheme circumscribes the area of history, what is worse, it rigs the stage. The ground of West Europe is treated as a steady pole, a unique patch, chosen on the surface of the sphere for no better reason, it seems, than because we live on it. And great histories of millennial duration and mighty faraway cultures are made to revolve around this pole in all modesty. This is what he calls the Ptolemaic conception of world history. The West is at the center. The West is the best. We've got the best toys, therefore we're the best. We are the peak of history, ancient, medieval, modern, and we're at the top. We're what history has been aiming for all along. It's incredibly narcissistic, our Western Ptolemaic view of ourselves as the center of the world. I think Spengler's on very firm ground here about this. It is a quaintly conceived system of sun and planets. We select a single bit of ground as the natural center of the historical system and make it the central sun. From it, all the events of history receive their real light. From it, their importance is judged in perspective. But it is in our own West European conceit alone that this phantom world history, which a breath of skepticism would dissipate, is acted out. We have to thank that conceit for the immense optical illusion become natural from long habit, whereby distant histories of thousands of years, such as those of China and Egypt, are made to shrink to the dimensions of mere episodes, while in the neighborhood of our own position, the decades since Luther, and particularly since Napoleon, loom large as Brocken specters. We know quite well that the slowness with which a high cloud or a railway train in the distance seems to move is only apparent, yet we believe that the tempo of all early Indian, Babylonian, or Egyptian history was really slower than that of our own recent past. And we think of them as less substantial, more damped down, more diluted, because we have not learned to make the allowance for inward and outward distances. And so when you read a history of the world, at least traditionally, maybe not so much anymore, but histories of the world would usually start, of course, with Egypt and Babylon, and there would be very short chapters, usually sometimes relegated even to footnotes, and then the Greeks come on stage, and then history begins with the Greeks. It's a ridiculous model, and it's totally wrong, but it's been propagated in the West over and over and over, especially by academics who just miss this altogether. It is self-evident that for the cultures of the West, the existence of Athens, Florence, or Paris is more important than that of Loyang or Pataliputra. But is it permissible to found a scheme of world history on estimates of such a sort? If so, then the Chinese historian is quite entitled to frame a world history in which the Crusades, the Renaissance, Caesar, and Frederick the Great are passed over in silence as insignificant. How, from the morphological point of view, should our 18th century be more important than any other of the 60 centuries that preceded it?
Is it not ridiculous to oppose a modern history of a few centuries, and that history to all intents localized in West Europe, to an ancient history which covers as many millennia, incidentally dumping into that ancient history the whole mass of the pre-Hellenic cultures, unprobed and unordered, as mere appendix matter? This is no exaggeration. Do we not, for the sake of keeping the hoary scheme, dispose of Egypt and Babylon, each as an individual and self-contained history, quite equal in the balance to our so-called world history, from Charlemagne to the World War and well beyond it, as a prelude to classical history? Do we not relegate the vast complexes of Indian and Chinese culture to footnotes with a gesture of embarrassment? As for the great American cultures, do we not, on the ground that they do not fit in with what? Entirely ignore them? Yeah, Mesoamerica usually gets ignored. Even in Toynbee's 3 different generations, first generation, second generation, third generation, he doesn't mention the Mesoamerican civilization, which gets up and running 1200 BC at the same time as China, and deserves to be recognized as part of the second generation, even though the Mesoamerican civilization, beginning with the Olmecs, and very strongly affiliated to the Chinese, this is a point of soreness for academics who want to believe that this civilization was not affiliated to anything, but was a spontaneous creation of our Native American world. It absolutely was not. There was plenty of intercourse with China. There's lots of influence of Chinese motifs, mythological figures, gods, the way things are laid out, the way cities are laid out, the use of jade in burials, all kinds of things that, if you compare Olmec culture with Shang Dynasty culture, these guys were interacting. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. But they get relegated. I mean, the tenor, the culture of the Mesoamerican civilization is not philosophical in the slightest, and so in a way, it's vestigial from the first generation. It really kind of belongs to the first generation, which is purely mythical. It too has an evolution of theological ideas and doctrines over time as it moves from the Olmec to the Maya to the Aztecs, and then down south there's another civilization with the Inca that also has its own timeline. And so the Mesoamerican civilizations get overlooked quite a bit. The most appropriate designation for this current West European scheme of history, in which the great cultures are made to follow orbits round us as the presumed center of all world happenings, is the Ptolemaic system of history. The system that is put forward in this work in place of it I regard as the Copernican discovery in the historical sphere, in that it admits no sort of privileged position to the classical or the Western culture as against the cultures of India, Babylon, China, Egypt, the Arabs, Mexico. Separate worlds of dynamic being, which in point of mass count for just as much in the general picture of history as the classical, while frequently surpassing it in point of spiritual greatness and soaring power. So this is a book, I think, that stands the test of time because it has this idea that all of history does not revolve around the West. The West is in no way in a privileged position vis-a-vis the rest. Every single one of them has their own unique world horizon, has their own contributions, has their own spiritual greatness and flowering. That's Spengler's vision of a Copernican vision of history, and I think it's a total innovation and totally unique, and is still absolutely relevant, even under postmodern conditions that often critique the West and critique this idea of the West being the best and the rest are laggards that are following along. Spengler's model does not do that. It does not privilege the West. It takes the West and the classical civilization and puts them down as figure in the ground of a realm, not of history, but of histories. Each civilization has its own historical unfolding, and its own life cycle, its own tempo, its own spirituality that is equally as great as the West or the classical civilization, which are in no way privileged in this book. So I think this is quite an achievement here. This book is still relevant today, and recently Spengler's birthday passed about a week ago. I think it was his 140th. I forget what it was exactly, but no, it can't be that.
1880 to 1980, 100, yeah, I guess it was 140th. So going back over him is very relevant. So we'll continue with the introduction and this idea of chewing on the Western timelines and how those timelines developed, the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, the New Stone Age, how these timelines got developed by ethnographers, historians, archaeologists, and scientists who put all this timeline together that Spengler is very suspicious of and has a lot of skepticism toward.